The start of this is in a very different place than you might imagine. I want to, before I go to high policy, focus on a simple example of the way in which the people in this room have helped transform Australian energy efficiency policy in the last year. I met in June last year with the fellows from Eninoc, one of your sponsors, Paul and Ross, amongst others. They put to me an idea in terms of something that you're well aware of, that I was aware of, but hadn't quite understood was such a gap in the Australian energy efficiency landscape, and that was the issue of demand-side bidding into the national electricity market. And they explained how we could do it simply, what needed to be done to support it, but that really there was a gap at the highest levels in terms of policy support. It happens that 3 days later I was invited onto Late Line. I was asked about our electricity approach and what we'd be doing to take pressure off the price of electricity. And they said, well, what would you do other than the carbon tax? So I set out the fact that there were three elements to what we were doing, one of which was removal of the carbon tax, and I understand not everybody will agree with that, but I'll deal with the options there. The second of which was reforms to the national electricity market, and the third of which, as a component of that, was the support for demand-side bidding to allow energy efficiency to be bundled as a product or demand reductions on any particular day, whether it's through prior agreements or remote arrangements in particular with large-scale commercial premises such as supermarkets. You all understand this better than anybody in Australia. And I am now told by Rob Murray-Leach, with whom I met in my office late last week, that in some small way the work of Eninoc through the opposition gave a licence to the AEMC and AEMO to argue with the government that there was bipartisan support. Governments come on board, and that's the way in which a policy change is almost certain to eventuate. And if we get across the line, it will certainly eventuate. I tell that as a story to give you a sense of the speed with which policy in this space can move and the ability that you have directly to impact. So that is one example. Let me then step back for a second and just to give you a brief overview and then to take questions. I've prepared a much longer paper, so you can take that with you. It's, I think, about 4,500 words, and I hope it'll be distributed in electronic rather than paper format in order to save a very large number of trees. But that's an extensive explanation of the policy directions, and you can come back to me either directly or through Jonathan or through anybody else, and my office to probe on any questions. The overview here is that as a coalition, what we're trying to do is to, if we are given the opportunity to govern, to provide an environment based on opportunity and incentive. Now, we'll do that through 5 major plans, through an economic recovery plan, through a stronger communities plan, a cleaner environment plan, a national security plan, and a national infrastructure plan. All of that will be distributed to you so as you have that overview. In particular, in the environment space, there are 4 pillars to what we want to do. So in the environment space, we want to focus on, let's see if that will run, clean air, which is direct action, clean land, clean water, and heritage. The clean land side of things is about the 15,000 young people in the environment working in teams of 10 in a green army. But it's also about a one-stop shop for environmental approvals. That's not about diminishing standards, but it is about the ability to implement significant projects with tough environmental standards, but within a short period of time. Let's get decisions made. I will be happy to give a green light and equally happy to give a red light to a project, but to be able to do this through a single consolidated approval system. New Zealand has a 9-month woe-to-go approach for considering, approving, deciding and either accepting or rejecting proposals where there's an environmental determination allowed. That's what we ought to be able to do in Australia, and that's a way that for many of you who are involved in large-scale projects, whether it's commercial construction, whether it's industrial development, industrial transformation, your energy efficiency work can be delayed by months or years whilst broader approvals are being waited on. Secondly, the clean water side of things. There's a Reef 2050 plan which is focused on controlling reduction and runoff in the reef. That's linked, of course, to the Murray-Darling plan, where we gave bipartisan support to a once-in-a-century replumbing of rural Australia. Many of you who are involved in energy efficiency are also involved in water efficiency, and it is the Murray-Darling Basin which has provided the model for what we want to do at a national level on the clean air or emissions reduction side. We have used water buybacks on a competitive basis. We are doing tendering for infrastructure to reduce water use and increase efficiency on a competitive basis of cost per megalitre. And so that's exactly the same principle that we want to take. And in the same way, we're also looking at encouraging water use in terms of hydro, water retention, flood mitigation through dams in northern Australia. Again, that would be done on a cautious environmental basis, but it's time for Australia to consider that, so as we have the food production where the water is. It will actually take pressure off the Murray-Darling Basin. That then brings me to what we're proposing in terms of clean air and direct action. And I really want to address it in three elements here. Firstly is the Emissions Reduction Fund and how that will operate and how you could benefit and participate. The second is in terms of the renewable energy target, and the third is in terms of distributed energy, the million roofs solar plan, and also to look at what we'd be doing with the 20 million trees on the site. So the debate about the carbon tax is well-traversed ground. Everybody in this room will understand it. Many will support it, some may not. Our thinking is this: the problem for Australia is that emissions go up, not down, under the carbon tax, that it's a major electricity tax. You understand the economics of electricity as well as anybody in this country, the relative inelasticity, the fact that we have an essential service. We've seen prices almost double over the last 6 years in Australia, and I met with AEMO recently, with the energy market operator, and their take is that the 6% change in energy consumption was based 3% to do with overseas demand for Australian goods, with the depressed demand in Europe, which flowed through to China and the United States, and also linked to the high dollar. 1% due to the increase of distributed energy solar installations, 1% due to seasonal weather factors over the last year. That was prior to this summer. I haven't seen updated figures, where we had a modest summer a year ago and a relatively moderate winter, and so in each direction the cooling and heating demands were not as great. And then about 1/6 of the change was due to price sensitivity. So what they said to us is massive changes in price had very little impact in terms of direct demand. So you say, well, how do we overcome this problem of relative insensitivity without having to drive up prices and therefore the cost of living and the cost of business and with a relative comparative disadvantage for Australia to other countries? And what we have done is we've proposed a carbon buyback, or you might also call it a reverse auction. It's the same process that we use in relation to buying back water in this country. So there are a number of ways that this could be done, but our essential parameter is this. We will hold a reverse auction. We will invite bids, and there's really a two-stage process. Firstly, is the abatement that's being proposed legitimate, measurable and verifiable? That's the role for the Clean Energy Regulator. It's how they work at the moment with the Carbon Farming Initiative. Secondly, once we've got through that stage, and that's not a difficult stage, there are established methodologies, is it something which is lowest cost? And so we simply hold an auction and we purchase the lowest cost emissions reduction. And this is where energy efficiency comes in. At the moment, perversely, it fails to qualify in the way that it did under the G-gas system in New South Wales, under the carbon farming initiative. It's largely locked out of the abatement process under the carbon tax, and so something with an enormous potential. I think the Energy Efficiency Council has sized it as potentially well over 20 million tonnes per annum of abatement by 2020, isn't being given the proper incentive base. Now, if we are... the way that you might be able to operate is this. Let's say that you grossed up 1 million tonnes of potential abatement a year over 5 years. It might be a combination of an electricity company with a long customer base, working with somebody like Boral or Multiplex or firms that are engaged in energy efficiency such as Enenoc. You might say that we will do 100,000 house transformations, we might do 1,000 small businesses, and we might do 100 industrial sites, and we will bid in 1 million tonnes a year. If that comes in as the lowest cost, or of course we'll be purchasing on a larger scale, then you'll have the guarantee of a contract for delivery. And the way we've designed it is that if you deliver the abatement, you'll get the payment. We don't have to pay up front. We'll pay at the end of each year as the abatement is delivered. You then know that you have a guaranteed contract. And interestingly, this was exactly the model which the government has released not long ago as the basis for what they call a non-Kyoto carbon fund. So they have picked up a reverse auction model. They've described it as a market mechanism. They have it as a contract for delivery. So literally all of the elements which we've proposed. And the reason we do this is because every dollar spent is spent on actual abatement, and it's not discharged until the abatement has been complete. But you can go ahead in the certainty that if you deliver, there will be a payment. So that's the first thing, and I'm of course happy to take any questions in relation to that. The second area is in relation to the renewable energy target. We will be keeping the renewable energy target. We've made that commitment. We have no plans or proposals to change it. The one area where we disagree with the government is that it was created on the basis of a 2-yearly review, and we want to see where electricity consumption is heading in 2014, but we have no plans or intention for change, and we've offered bipartisan support to that, and we will maintain bipartisan support towards the 20% target. The third area is in terms of distributed generation, which is of course one of the themes for the conference. Now, we have a modest 1 million roofs proposal over a decade. That's 100,000 roofs a year. That will be primarily targeted on a rebate basis towards low-income earners with a combination of solar PV and solar hot water. We want to be able to encourage both, but we particularly want to be able to assist low-income earners. We're happy to discuss any of the design details. I see people like Rick Brazali, who's been assisting in discussions not just over the last 6 months but over the last 6 years. So that's all backed up by the idea that we want to support the re-greening of our cities. We don't want to pretend that these things will happen overnight, but if we can deal with urban heat island effects, we have a quality of life impact, we have an emissions reduction impact, and we also have an energy efficiency impact. When you compare those suburbs that are built with trees and those without trees, as some of the developers have said to me, it literally makes an urban heat island difference of 3 or 4 degrees, and we unashamedly, for reasons of quality of life as well as energy efficiency as well as emissions reduction, want to do something in that space. But the big prize here is about what we do through the emissions reduction fund, the reverse auction, and it's an abatement approach rather than taxing outputs. So that's a quick summary of what we're proposing. There's more detail in the paper, but I wanted to lay out the guidelines and how it applies to the energy efficiency sector, to thank you for having been part of it, and then to invite any questions, criticisms or suggestions. And the sort of thing that we did with Enenoc and that we've done with the Energy Efficiency Council or RIC or so many others here is open as you go forward, whether it's the next 6 months or the next 12 months, If we are successful, you have an open invitation to come and present ideas, and don't just sit on your hands. If you think that there's a problem, we need to know. All right, thank you.
We have an opportunity to ask questions.
You can phone them in if you want. So,
I understand Greg's got about 7 minutes before he has to leave.
Oh well, we got a bit longer, but
I'd be happy to take questions. Maybe if you could come to the microphone and first come, first served. While you're doing that, I might just ask one question. One thing that interests me about the direct action policy in terms of the emission reduction fund. Where's the revenue source for the funding?
We have to. It's not hypothecated funding; it's general budget revenue. Right. We have to make the savings, and I've done that. One of the things that we've been completely upfront about is that we would merge the departments of climate and environment. I think it's a natural synergy. It's a natural efficiency, and it's something that should be done. But across the whole of government, there are savings that we need to make. I lived through the home insulation program, which should have been a very simple energy efficiency program. Many of you will have warned about it, seen it in operation, recognised that what should have been a simple energy efficiency program through maladministration had a massive amount of waste. It was meant to be 2.7 million homes. It ended up being 1 million homes, and the last 500 million of which was spent on undoing the damage that had been done, on literally fixing more than 100,000 roofs. So there is a massive amount of waste which can be saved. We're doing it in every portfolio, so that's just our overarching theme as a government. The figures, by the way, are 300 million, 500 million and 750 million over the first 3 years for the Emissions Reduction Fund. It's not a king's ransom, but it's calculated to achieve our abatement targets.
Very good. We'll take the first question.
Hi, I just had a bit of a question about the rationale that you gave for why it was the carbon price wasn't necessarily effective, based off the idea that there is that inelasticity to the price that people are willing to pay for electricity. In a lot of ways, that's actually, as far as I understand, a little bit irrelevant to that conversation because people aren't dealing directly with the wholesale price. So that inelasticity is not reflected in consumer behaviour. It's much more about how the market operates in regards to the costs of the electricity. So wouldn't it make sense if there was going to be an impost onto like high emissions energy sources? They would still be directly impacted, and therefore there would be that direct market mechanism that would be driving towards cleaner sources.
Sure. There are two theoretical arguments used to justify the carbon tax. Well, the third one is a sort of a punitive one, which is a moral argument. The first two are a supply side and a demand side. So the demand side relates to the sensitivity. Effectively, when you tax an essential service, people substitute out of other goods. They rarely substitute out of the essential service in any significant way, unless, of course, you had radical price shock, in which case you've literally got social chaos. The supply side is a very interesting argument. There are a number of people here who would have worked on the supply side and the relative costs of the wholesale electricity. And the gap between the brown coal providers and the black coal and the gas and then the renewable energy is such that it's not until you start to get up well over the $60 per tonne carbon price that you have any significant effect on the merit order. At the moment, the brown coal providers have all said, well, we're just passing through the costs. That's what we do. We pass through the costs. We can do that because there's no risk of change to the merit order. And so even on the government's own figures, you're getting out literally decades before there's any significant change in the merit order. So you've got to have a massive price hike in order to do that. Otherwise, you can sometimes just go and do things directly, and that is, we can go and support waste coal mine gas clean-up, waste landfill gas clean-up, conversion of power stations from brown coal to gas, or the implementation of better flue gas technologies, or the implementation of if you wanted to look at a more radical algal energy transformation or general energy efficiency in the domestic, commercial or industrial space. And we'll do it all on literally the straight up merit order of the lowest cost abatement. So that's my response to the theory behind the carbon tax, that it doesn't work as a demand side tool and it doesn't seem to work particularly as a supply side tool.
Thanks, Greg. If I could ask you to please keep questions short, and if you could give your name and affiliation when you ask the question.
Thank you. Thanks, Greg. My name's Lex from Ironbark Sustainability, and thank you for outlining that. My understanding, and maybe from others in the room, is that you clearly are intelligent and you understand what's going on. There are some people
there are a few quizzical looks, yes.
You might be working with a few people in 6 to 8 months in your party that aren't quite as up to speed with the 21st century. Like, I wouldn't want to name names, Barnaby Joyce. But the issue is, at the moment, I'd imagine that you are still fighting pretty hard from this because you do understand it, but there are a lot in your party that don't, a lot in every party that don't. That, to me, isn't enough. It's not enough at the moment to get to what we all know we need. How are you going to do that, and how are you going to fight the good fight again within a party that has these beliefs?
Sure. Look, I appreciate the question. I would respectfully differ with the starting proposition, not so much about my intelligence, but about others.
Corey Bernardi?
And no, I just respectfully disagree. And what you may be surprised about is almost the first item penciled into the coalition's budget is the emissions reduction fund, and then associated the Green Army. So I have colleagues who sort of scratch their heads and say, hang on, we're struggling to get a $10 million fund for this and a $20 million fund for that. And there you are, you've got over 4 years, $3.2 billion in total for the direct action package. And then there's the additional Green Army funding. And they have been sort of locked in as fundamental elements going forward. So I remember going through the program in the summer before it was announced with Tony Abbott and Andrew Robb. We all had wide consultations. We'd done the first draft, and having long days where Tony engaged in the high principle but also the micro detail. And so he's actually very, very engaged in this and has become very, very supportive and sees it as a policy which he believes in because of the benefits. Irrespective of where you stand on a range of issues, you want waste coal mine gas, you want clean up, you want landfill gas clean up, you want energy efficiency, you want the soil carbons and the revegetation, as well as the overall emissions reduction. So there hasn't been any challenge in defending that internally. That's an honest view. It's just accepted as part of the policy landscape.
Next question, please.
Yeah, Phil Harrington, Pint and Sherry. Look, thanks, Greg. Look, I'm sure many, if not the vast majority of people in this room would be very grateful to have heard your commitment to renewable energy target and to solar roofs, which, again, a lot of people here will support, and would certainly agree with the proposition that energy efficiency is a huge opportunity for direct action.
I think, if anything, we have underestimated that. It's over the last couple of years, I think the figures have moved your way, but we're still being conservative in what we would look at.
You won't get any argument from people in this room, I think, about that. But look, the one bit that perhaps we're struggling with a little more is the emissions reduction fund or the buyback scheme. I mean, we have had schemes like that in the past, both at state level and also, at the federal level with the greenhouse gas abatement program that the old Australian Greenhouse Office used to run. And I guess my question really is, if we're buying back carbon, how do we avoid paying for something that, quite frankly, business ought to be able to do by itself? And have you really thought about that? Are we going to need a system of kind of benchmarking or something that makes sure that we don't pay for something that, quite frankly, pays for itself?
Sure. Now, that is a very important question, and it's not just that we've thought about it. We've had long hours focused on it with what you might call a tiger team. And the simple answer is we've already got a very, very good architecture in place. We have two things which are fundamental. One is the NGES system, And then the second is the Carbon Farming Initiative. Now, the Carbon Farming Initiative is an abatement scheme based on methodology versus business as usual. All we do is we expand out the Carbon Farming Initiative. We're committed to the Carbon Farming Initiative because really it's a vehicle for abatement, and we expand it out to include additional methodologies. They all have to be robust. I am not opposed to bringing in from overseas things such as through the CDM, the methodologies which have been established as international gold standard, so long as they apply appropriately to Australia and they're approved by the Clean Energy Regulator. So we use those absolutely bulletproof methodologies, and if it's not a bulletproof methodology, I'm not interested. So there are always two hurdles. Is it measurable and verifiable abatement? That's the regulator. And then is it lowest cost, which is the purchaser? So hopefully that gives you a bit more comfort on that.
Please, next question.
Yes, Jeff Beale, electricity customer and retired electricity engineer, electricity supply engineer. In New South Wales and Queensland, the electricity distributors are almost perfectly placed to help customers, and in residential customers and businesses, improve their energy efficiency. But why would they do so? Because for every reduction in energy sold, they basically lose revenue and it goes straight through to their bottom line.
Exactly.
Now, the problem then is that how do you give those distributors a charter to take on a role that they don't otherwise want?
Okay, well, this is, bizarrely, the precise question which Rob Murray-Leach got on a plane, the great metal bird, travelled down to Melbourne, travelled out to Hastings, came to my office and discussed last Friday. And what we were focusing on is this idea of benchmarking for electricity efficiency, so as there is an incentive to do this against business as usual. And I have to say this, that I'm very focused on not just inputs but outputs. And you say, well, what does that mean? One of the ways of doing this, and the United States, and Rob was able to give me some interesting examples from around the world, the United States has been able to benchmark on actual electricity reduction, something which is absolutely measurable because you've got previous bills with current bills, and if you gross that up over 100,000 houses, then you can get a change which shows what was the reduction. It includes any bounce back because total consumption is less, but therefore we might spend a bit more heating the house. So you are actually paying for real reductions, and that's a gap in the system at the moment. That's the problem of landlord and tenant perverse incentives. Let me ask this. I've got a plane at 5 or one at 5:30. I'm happy to stay on because this is actually a really important discussion, but nor do I want to muck up your program. No, you can vote me off the island now, or I can take another few questions. These are really important questions.
We're flexible, and we can move back a quarter an hour, can't we, Chris?
Yes, we can. I'll try and do it in 10.
Just one question with the reverse auction process. If you've got a reverse auction which is just based on lowest cost, how do you ensure that you get the big juicy projects done, like the cogeneration projects and the fundamental infrastructure projects done, and you don't just do thousands of one-year payback lighting projects?
Because we're willing to do them over multiple years, so we're happy to do long-term contracting as part of it.
But those big juicy projects will probably have a higher cost per tonne than the.
Well, a lot of them done over multiple years won't. But remember, I'm not in the business of buying the high cost projects. If it's a higher cost way of reducing emissions, I do prefer the lower cost way. My goal is to achieve 155 million tonnes of abatement. So Australia's set to, Australia's heading off to 692 million tonnes of production of emissions by 2020 on the government's baseline figures. I think they're a bit high. They haven't taken into account certain elements. We need to get down to 537 million tonnes. So what's our target? What's our real objective? To find that 155 million tonnes. And what's my objective? To find that in the lowest cost way. And unashamedly so, because we can get more bang for our buck if we're getting the lowest cost. Sometimes people say, look, this would be a great project. It's 3 times more expensive than another project, but wouldn't it be iconic? And I say, well, it may be iconic, but if I can buy 3 times more abatement, which is real and measurable and verifiable, then that's what I would rather do at a third of the cost.
No, I understand your point. There may be some problems with that, but we can talk about it another time.
I'm going to be counselled offline.
Greg, Rod Welford, we've met before in relation to another sector, the recycling sector, but I'm with my energy hat on today. Thanks for being here and being willing to discuss these issues. I think it's great to see, and you're clearly giving a lot of time to the various people in the industry. Rob Murray-Leach gets lots of praise, of course. He's everywhere. I guess my question is this. I don't, in principle, disagree with the idea of a reverse auction. I think it is actually a pretty powerful way to drive abatement, energy savings and abatement. I guess the question I have is, leaving aside the government's carbon tax and accepting that your decision, your party's decision has been made in relation to the carbon tax regime. You mentioned before the carbon clean development mechanism, and you mentioned earlier the idea around a market in arbitrage of energy efficiency savings, energy savings. Why, given that you said, it's not a king's ransom for the emissions reduction fund, why wouldn't you supplement that with the capacity for businesses that do make savings to be able to trade those savings into a market, both within Australia and internationally?
Look, there's nothing stopping businesses. Let's say you run an energy efficiency firm, or let's just take the carbon farming initiative at the moment, and somebody's involved in a piggery project, a piggery transformation project, or somebody's involved with a waste landfill gas project. Nobody is compelled to sell to the government. If you have a credit issued, it's always been the case that under our system you could sell to us, or if you wanted to sell it to, if there was demand elsewhere overseas, we wouldn't stand in the way. We are just not setting up a trading market for Australia, but there's nothing which has ever been in the way of, in relation to our system, farmers, landholders, industrialists, energy efficiency practitioners treating their savings and having them recognised, and you can choose where you market your savings or your abatement.
Don't you need a trading market, though, to do that within Australia? You can't just go out into the street and say, someone want to buy my savings.
Well, there are plenty of opportunities available. We're not setting up a trading market ourselves.
So you mean Europe or China or America or something?
We have always said that it's entirely a matter for those that produce abatement whether or not they choose to sell it to the government, or if they want to sell it elsewhere. There may be people on the voluntary market who would buy it, or there may be people on the internationally who would purchase it. That's no change from day one. I see Tristan Edis here, so I just want to confirm, no change from day one.
Just to continue on Rod's question, what's your feeling about extending the existing state white certificate programs to a national scheme?
Well, effectively what we are doing by creating an abatement recognition program for energy efficiency is doing that. We're just not mandating specific firms making specific reductions. We're doing it through an incentive scheme. So at the moment there's a massive gap at the national level in terms of recognition of energy efficiency and bundling of energy efficiency, and we would be creating that opportunity. So ideally I would like to see one single national abatement scheme and one single national reporting scheme. I mean, everybody would like one single national reporting scheme with all the groups we've spoken about, and I think that can be achieved. We take NGAs as the base. I've had discussions with all of the state coalition environment ministers and shadows, and provisional agreement, I won't speak for them, but provisional agreement to the direction of a single national reporting scheme, which is what NGAs was always intended to have been.
Next question.
Yeah, hi. Brad Schultz from Honeywell. It's a bit of a follow-up from the question before. I guess you've addressed sort of, I guess, the coalition's commitment to these policies. But I think the other part of the question was, that the outlook, the scientific consensus keeps getting worse, and both parties, major parties' approaches to this falls far, far short of a containing climate change to 2 degrees of warming. And obviously there's debate, but I think most people in this room, I think, would have to admit that the policies put out there by both parties don't go anywhere near close enough to even. The conversation isn't really even seriously about that. The targets that you talk about, don't go anywhere near to Australia playing its part. And I'm just interested in you sort of tackling that question really head on and saying what does it need to take before the government will really talk about that openly and about what we really have to do to contain global warming.
Well, we set out not just the targets but the bipartisan support for conditions for any change, and that change to higher targets is something we've given conditional support for. And if those conditions are met, then it will matter if we do it. If those conditions are not met, then the gesture won't have any impact. So there are really 2 parts to it. There's the domestic and the international. The key thing for the world, in my view, is a genuine, deep agreement between the US and China. If that happens, everything else flows from that. You can supplement that with India and the EU. So if you get those 4 players together, then you get the basis of a G4 agreement, and the world will follow. I will put a lot of work into doing everything we can to help get a G4 agreement with Australia as one of a number of facilitators. You don't want to overpromise or overpretend, because those things will be decided at the presidential level of the 2 great superpowers. But Australia can play a role in helping to bridge the G4. We may in fact use the G20 group or the major economies process. The second thing is, then domestically, we are committed to the 5% and the conditions for higher targets. And we've actually designed our system as a modular system. I think that we have underestimated publicly the abatement available, and we have overestimated the cost, but I'd much rather do conservative budgeting, achieve our targets, and then have capacity to go further. So look, I remain realistic, but ultimately a believer that we will be able to broker an international agreement. I wouldn't predict when, but I think in time. And I also think that there are extraordinary technologies out there. One of the things that I think will be transformative in the world is the algal energy. The smartest minds and the best business brains in America are working on the algal energy issue, which has an enormous CO2 absorptive capacity. It has a displacement of conventional oil, and it runs much cleaner than other fuels, and therefore it's, I think, a profoundly important technology for the world going forwards, and other things. So I remain upbeat about where our children and our grandchildren will be.
Okay. Steve Nadell with the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. So yes, I'm from the States. I wanted to pick up on a couple of the comments before. You mentioned energy benchmarking and rewarding the distribution companies that actually help to save, because now they have an incentive to increase their sales. In the United States, about half the states now give the utilities a share of the savings to the extent they hit energy saving targets.
Brilliant. That's exactly what it's effectively what we are proposing.
Okay. The question is, we've done some demand side bidding, not carbon bidding, but demand side. We do get some significant savings. It's tended to be a little bit more expensive than if the utilities directly operate the programs. It's only getting some of the savings. The question is, what would you think about either extending the energy saving certificates to national, or at least offering incentives to encourage the states to do it? Would that just be through this bidding program, or could there be something a bit more directed specifically toward the distribution utilities?
Sure. Look, the energy efficiency abatement model is the way that we're proposing. We've been, as I say, meeting with the sector about that. I would love to get some input on how it's worked, what are the best examples and the worst examples in the United States. The basic model is something we want to keep very simple. Bid in your energy efficiency, and if it's the lowest cost, we'll support it. It immediately overcomes the issue of landlord and tenant. We'd encourage the state governments to bid in, and I've raised this with a number of them, their own operations, because they are enormous energy consumers. Okay. Oh, sorry.
My question is short. I am Igor Skramin from the Australian National University, and it again relates to your proposal of abatement program.
Yes.
The question is very simple. You propose several measures, a range of measures, and that will be contracted and company participating in that. What will happen when this program is completed and all money spent? What ensures that the system will not bounce back to the original conditions? We need to look something for decades forward.
Sure. Look, many of the transformations will be permanent transformations.
But how it will be?
If you transform a power station, for example, that's a permanent saving, and the benchmark changes after a period of years once its full life has been played out through the emissions reduction fund. So what that does is it progressively changes the benchmark for individual firms that have participated. So there are permanent changes, and I expect the permanent change to be the overwhelming bulk of what's achieved. So we've given quite considerable thought to that. We've spoken to many of the large utilities, the industrial organisations, and then, of course, the energy efficiency changes as well. I do think that, in a sense, this election will probably determine which of the models is in place in Australia for the next 20 years. You don't have to agree or disagree, but I suspect that one way or other it will be determinative of option A, the carbon tax, option B, the abatement approach. And I think that will pretty much determine the model for the next 20 years.
Am I just concerned that abatement approach can turn out to be required to stay for years to come, right? And will be continuous burden on government spending in this approach, whether a carbon tax is some system that embedded for a long period with a long-term vision and does not depend on each year's spending and budget program.
Well, there have already been 8 significant changes to the legislation or practice in the first 7 months, so under the carbon tax alone. So I'd respectfully say that I think it's been not entirely stable so far.
All right, okay, thanks.
Peter Harris from Simplot Australia.
I'll just take the last two and then
Yes.
I better...
Peter Harris, Simplot Australia. If the Coalition wins the election, what would happen to the Clean Technology Investment Program in the future, and also for applications made before the election?
Sure. We won't be continuing with the program, but we will honour contracts which have been struck before the caretaker period. That's a general principle we've put in place. The one exception is because it hasn't even begun, no money's gone out under the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. We have said that nothing can go out until the 1st of July, and if it does go out, it would go out in the billions. We have given fair and public warning that we won't be continuing with, or in any way, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation grants and programs. The other grant programs, we have also said, and I wanted to be very clear because of the issue of continuity, we will honour contracts. We won't try to claw back any funds, so long as they've all been legitimately granted. I don't think the Bede family's received any grants. I hope not.
Michael Kane, Economic Development Queensland. We're a Queensland Government land developer. Just a question about the 1 million roofs policy. It's actually been one of your policies for some time. And one of the issues, I think, in the last few years, that government incentives on solar PV has actually been arguably overly successful, and no one from the government point of view, state or federal, has really worked out how to mature that incentives. And one of the things I think people here have been discussing is the need to I think, incentivise batteries into home solar PV, and whether that can be done a number of ways. One, I think batteries will be probably least, or probably the most effective way that can be done, and depreciating batteries, if that was given a more generous basis, we'd actually see a higher uptake of batteries, and solar PV would be more successful in terms of having reducing peak load for one, because at the moment it makes the problem worse with voltage issues. And if we can get the 1 million roofs to actually have a positive impact on peak, then that would be a great success.
I actually visited a solar store which was engaged in development and distribution of battery technology for supporting PV in Brisbane, in Teresa Gambaro's electorate of Brisbane, so the inner suburbs. And it did strike me that the price was extremely high at this time. So there's still I think there's a significant technology curve and cost curve for it to come down before it becomes attainable.
We're developing some strategies where the cost is quite low, and I think some of the newer technologies are very expensive, but some of the more standard technologies are affordable, and this is where it will work more on a leasing basis. And this is why I think we need to think through how this could work.
Could I invite a short submission or policy proposal? I don't want to overcommit, but when you look at the way, and let me finish with where I began, the way that the Enernoc contribution came in on demand side bidding, they came to us with a serious proposal. We considered it and then we proceeded with it, and that has hopefully had some impact on the national landscape. I'd similarly invite a submission on this, because it's an area to crack, this issue of storage. Thank you very much. I respect what you're doing, and the invitation is open for ideas at any time.
And I'd like you to all join me to thank Greg for being so generous of his time